This is the process called lost wax casting. And the very first thing we need to do is prepare our wax, whatever we're going to make for this particular casting. This class we focused on making rings. And this is what the wax looks like in its form before we start carving. It's pretty carvable with different kinds of tools. Mostly we use sharp dentist tools, or we actually use files that are made for working with wax. Here's an example of a ring that was carved using this green wax. And here's a manufactured ring that was purchased at a store. So you can either make your own or you can buy pieces that are already made in wax. What we need to do after we're done making our wax piece is we need to put a sprue on it. And that is this long wax wire right here. And what that allows, or what that does, is it makes a tunnel. Once we invest our piece, make a mold, that allows a tunnel for the metal to pass through to reach the ring, to cast it. So the sprue has to be fairly thick. What my students used is a red wax, same thing, about the same thickness. And we simply attach that to a part of the ring where there's not a lot of detail. That way, when it's cast in metal, we can take a saw and cut that off and file it and finish it so we don't hurt any part of our intricate design. And the way we do that is we use an alcohol torch or an alcohol lamp. This would be filled with alcohol. We would light it and again use a hot tool, and we would melt the sprue wire onto our wax. You can see this one has already been done, and then we'll take our tool again and make it about 1 inch or so. Okay, it doesn't have to be extremely long. So this ring is ready to invest to make a mold. So the next step would be to weigh. Okay, it's very important that we weigh our wax before we cast it, and we use a gram scale. And it looks like this one's going to weigh about, the whole thing weighs about 2 grams. So it's important that we write that down and keep that information separate. Okay, after we weigh our wax, we need to determine the size of flask that is appropriate. We have 3 different flasks here, and it's just a steel shell that holds our investment material. And if we hold up our ring inside of here, we want at least 1/2 inch surrounding this ring on all sides and including the top. So this would be a little small for this piece. We go to our next one, and this would be appropriate. So this flask is good to use. And this base goes with this flask. It's just a rubber base, and in the center it's filled with clay. So that ring gets pushed into the clay. Make sure that's in there really nice and tight. And then we can hold up our flask and make sure that it's centered inside. That's important also. Our next step would be to take a chemical called vacuum film or debubblizer, and we paint that on our entire wax piece. And that just makes our piece very slick. So when we pour our investment, which is a plaster-like material, air bubbles won't stick to our wax, because air bubbles can cause little imperfections when we start the casting process. So we paint this on the entire piece, inside, outside, put a good coating on there. Once that is finished, we can put our flask on our base to enclose our wax piece. After that's done, we need to determine how much investment to pour into our flask. And there is a chart that we use. If we measure the height of our flask and then the diameter, okay, we can cross-reference a chart that tells us how much investment to mix. And our investment, again, looks like a plaster material. It's a nice powder material, and we weigh it out on a gram-ounce scale. And then we have to mix that with the appropriate amount of water, and we use lukewarm water. So once we mix that really well, we usually use a mixer. Okay, so we don't want it to be lumpy, we want to get all lumps out. A nice kind of milkshake consistency. When it's still in this plastic bowl or rubber bowl, we'll bring it over here to what's called a vacuum caster. And putting this bell on here, okay, creates a vacuum environment. It sucks all the air out of there. So we turn on our machine and it sucks all the air out of here and it releases all the air bubbles up to the surface, because again, we don't want air bubbles in our mold. So we do that in the bowl. Then we bring our flask over again to the vacuum caster and we pour our investment into our flask pretty much all the way to the top. Sometimes we might have to put tape around the top to extend our investment. And again, we put our bell on here, our dome, and we vacuum all the air out. After that is done, our mold is finished. We set it aside and we let it cure. Once the top gets hardened, we want to write some information on the top, like what metal we're casting with, the weight of the wax, and then initials so we know whose mold it is. So that's making the mold. From there, we actually can cast the next day. We want to let this cure overnight. Once it cures, we take our base off and we actually wrap it in a plastic bag. We don't want all the moisture to dry out of that mold. We want some moisture in the mold. Okay, so that's the mold making. All the molds go in here with the pour cup, okay, the area where the sprue is facing down. So once the wax starts to melt, it will either drip down or it will vaporize. And generally, depending on how many molds we have in here, we generally heat our kiln up to 700 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours. And then we bump that up to 900 degrees for another 2 hours. And then we bump that up again to 1200 degrees. And we maintain that 1200 degrees until we're ready to cast. So it's about a 6 to 8 hour process for our burnout. We call that a burnout when we're actually burning our wax material out of our molds. So once we reach the proper temperature of 1200 degrees for at least 2 hours, we're ready to cast. What we do after that is the weight that we've measured in wax, say our weight is 2 grams in wax, we need to multiply that number by the specific gravity of the metal. Each metal has a different specific gravity. Our class mostly use sterling silver, so we multiply that times 10.4. So a wax ring of 2 grams is going to be approximately 20 grams of sterling silver. So we would weigh out our 20 grams on this scale again and keep that metal, set that aside. We make sure it's clean. We could put it in our hot pickle solution to get it really nice and clean and rinse it off and dry it off. The next thing we do is prepare the centrifuge. The centrifuge is a machine that acts upon centrifugal force and pulls our molten metal into our mold. The first thing we do is make sure our crucible, okay, this is what we melt our metal in to get it to a liquid state. Here is a highly used crucible, and here's a brand new crucible. Big difference. If we have a new crucible, the first thing we do is heat it up, and we need to cover the entire inside with a dry powdered solution called flux. It's mostly borax, and it's just a nice powder form. And what that does is it creates a nice, slick, clean surface. So when we have our molten metal and we start to cast, it will be forced out of that crucible. So this is a crucible that we would use. It already has the flux on the inside. And we put that here in the harness of our centrifuge. And this centrifuge is spring-loaded, so we actually wind it up 3 times. And then we place a pin to keep the arm still. The centrifuge on one end has the crucible and a cradle where the mold fits, and on the other end is it's weighted. So when we release that pin, it spins rather quickly. So we would come over here and pull out our mold with our tongs. It's going to be very hot. And very carefully we set the mold into the cradle so the sprue cup and the opening of the crucible meet. Make sure those two are together. And we have a cold crucible, so we need to preheat our crucible. We use an oxygen acetylene torch for casting. That way we can melt our metal very rapidly. So we put on proper eye protection, dark sunglasses to keep harmful UV light away from our eyes. We turn on our gas, light our torch, and we adjust the oxygen. We preheat our crucible till we get a nice glowing orange, a nice red hot color, and then we can pour our metal in there, melt our metal. Once we get the metal melted, we'll add a little bit of flux with a little stirring rod, and then we'll stir up our metal to make sure it's all even, has a good liquid consistency. And at that point, we can take our torch away, drop the arm, and then we can let our centrifuge go, and it will just spin and force that molten metal into the opening of the mold. We let the centrifuge come to a stop on its own. Okay, and then we can remove our very hot mold with our tongs. And what we'll have is a nice, if the casting's gone well, we'll have a nice, what we call a button on our sprue cup. And we want to wait for that to cool down. We don't want to quench our mold right after we've cast it, because the metal inside of there is probably still red hot. If we quench that, it might hurt the casting. So we wait, 2 to 3 minutes for it to cool down. We have a bucket of water, so after our mold is cooled down, we can quench it in our water. And what that does is it is a pretty violent reaction towards the investment. It breaks away all the investment from your cast piece. You want to be careful that your piece doesn't fall into the bucket, but just break away enough of the investment to where you can see your piece, and then you can pull it out. And then we go ahead and clean our flask out. We want to scrape all the investment out of there, dry it off real nice, make sure it's nice and clean. And then our cast piece, we want to make sure that we scrape all the investment off. We can use different kinds of toothbrushes, lots of water, dentist tools to pick out all the investment. And then it's just cleaning and pickling from there. Cutting the sprue off with your jeweler's saw, filing and sanding if it's appropriate. And we're done.